So in 2008, the New South Wales government imposed a restriction on the central business district of Newcastle, requiring that 14 pubs that had been closing until 5 a.m, opening until 5 a.m, were required to close at 3 a.m. And this was prompted by action from the community that launched a complaint about disruption in the area, noise, violence, vomit on the streets and so on. And the police also launched a complaint under the Liquor Act. The Liquor Administration Board, which was a judicial body like a court in New South Wales, made the decision, and it came into effect in March 2008. So it came to my attention through the community activist Tony Brown, and it struck me as a very good opportunity because it affected the whole community, the whole precinct, rather than just one pub. It was likely to have quite a big effect. In addition, there was an area just to the west of Newcastle called Hamilton, where there were also late trading pubs that were not subject to the restriction. So it meant that there was a sort of control site, pretty unusual circumstances, and that made it an important thing to study. My background was in injury epidemiology, and I'd been studying traffic injury mainly, so this was a really good opportunity to study an effect of an important policy on an important health outcome. So the study we did utilised police data. It was provided, we formed a partnership with the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research in Sydney, who have expertise in the use of those data. So it was vital to have that knowledge. And we were able to compare the trend in assaults, the incidence of assault in the period up to 2008, for 7 years up to 2008, and with the change that occurred in the months and years that followed, and compare that change with what occurred in Hamilton over the same period, bearing in mind that Hamilton was not subject to a restriction. We found that the trend in assault just continued as it had been in Hamilton, just slow increases, year-on-year increases in the period that followed, that followed the restriction. But in Newcastle there was a 1/3 reduction in the assaults, and in fact we've followed that up over now 7 years after the change, and there is a 50%, assaults are now 50% lower than they were in 2008. In Sydney, so these findings were used as the basis for the decision in Sydney. The restriction was applied across the central business district, which is bounded by Darling Harbour to the west, King's Cross to the east, and sort of Central Station to the south. And the reduction in assaults in the period that followed the restriction that came into effect in February 2014 was 45% in King's Cross, in a specific area of King's Cross, and 20% in the CBD as a whole. And that amounts to 13 assaults per month in King's Cross, fewer than there were before the restriction, and 30 fewer assaults in the CBD. So you're talking about 43 fewer people being assaulted each month after the restriction came into effect in Sydney. So it's very hard to judge the effects of any one piece of research on a policy outcome. And generally I think researchers are inclined to overestimate the importance of what they're doing. I mean, that's a natural thing. I think in this case it's fair to say that it was a necessary but not sufficient condition. That is, by itself it's unlikely that anyone would have been moved to change the law as dramatically as it was changed in Sydney. The O'Farrell government in January 2014 had just had the news of the death of Daniel Christie, an 18-year-old who'd been punched in King's Cross and died 12 days later after a coma of 12 days. And then 18 months before that, a very similar incident occurred in King's Cross in which Thomas Kelly was killed. And in between there were a number of non-fatal but very serious events. So there were these deaths. There was a lot of media attention to them, and there was a real sense that something needed to be done. And the government had persisted in insisting that they would not be modifying the trading hours, that it was about, they framed it in terms of a law and order issue. But eventually, with considerable pressure from the public and the media having become united shortly before this decision was made, so the influence of a thoughtful campaign from public health advocates and the presence of the research, the ability to refer back to the research whenever there was pressure on government to say that this was an evidence-based approach. And Barry Farrell is on record and having said that it was important that they were able to direct people's attention to the research when they were being criticised for what they were doing. I think there are times when there are clearly times when policies change and when laws change in the absence of any sort of research evidence, and they're driven by other things. In this particular case, I think the evidence was important because with so much contestation, so much opposition to these laws from the industry, it was necessary to be able to reframe the argument in terms of the public health implications of continuing as we were. So being able to say that we were likely to have a 20% reduction in assaults per hour of restriction, which is what the evidence showed, meant that people could think about this in terms of the human toll. So the industry had to actually change its view from, rather than asserting that this was not going to help, the position then became more of an economic one. So they were saying that this is going to damage the industry and that it's going to destroy the nighttime economy and so on. And that was, I think, a much less persuasive position for the bulk of Australian voters. So I think the evidence in framing it as it did in terms of health outcomes and being able to quantify the effects probably was important. Yes, so what makes research impactful is a really important issue, and I think the key here is that there has to be a need for new knowledge that relates to something policy relevant. That there needs to be policy that is on the table, that is feasible, and then a question asked in a way in which the findings can be applied to that. So the research needs to be done from the outset with an eye to the policy outcome. Secondly, I think it's really important that there be champions for the policy, because even as we discussed earlier, the importance of public health advocates, community advocates in driving. So the publication of findings is not in itself is not enough. People don't look at journals by and large. The findings that are published in journals have to be interpreted and usually communicated in a media release, and then there's a real need to push it or run with the evidence and continue to apply pressure and make submissions and speak to the findings. So researchers can help by writing the results, their studies up in ways that are easily comprehended, and then in translating that information where there's technical content in media releases, and then repeatedly in radio, television interviews and newspaper articles, putting the research in context and not overstating the findings, being sure to state the qualifications, but putting the whole story in expressing it in a way that's meaningful to people who hear it. So the findings of research that are going to make an impact on policy need to be peer reviewed. They need to be robust, shown to be robust, and sort of beyond suspicion in terms of vested interests. So the interests of the researchers have to be declared and not in conflict with the findings. So transparency is very important. Conversely, we need to be able to counter the influence of vested interests. And when it comes to alcohol issues, and it's true for tobacco and gambling and other areas where there's a product for sale, the commentary, the framing by proponents of liberalised laws to make their products more easier to sell, we need to know about their vested interest and know when they're lobbying government, and know when what's behind their submissions, know what about their comments, media commentary, and understand, so that we've got a context for it and realise that it is indeed a vested interest. So that's also part of negotiating this space of contested evidence in relation to public policy. So another important aspect of trying to make research policy relevant is having organisations that act as a conduit, a connection between the research community and the public. and sort of translation sort of function. And the Sax Institute is one of those. And you know, its work is very important because it understands the policy world and also the research world. And sometimes those worlds don't, you know, coalesce very well.